My husband introduced me to his aunt, the daughter of a tech CEO. She and her parents mocked me for only having a college degree. When I threatened to withdraw my funds, they snickered. But when I pulled out my $250 million account, "What the hell did you do?" Miranda Wellington's voice was so high-pitched she sounded like she was inhaling helium. I could hear papers rustling frantically in the background and what sounded like multiple people talking in urgent whispers. "You moved $250 million. $250 million. Her panic was music to my ears after enduring that degrading dinner where she had dismissed my little hobby investments. Now the golden daughter of Silicon Valley venture capital was discovering that her family's empire had just been destroyed by the woman she had treated like an intellectual inferior. I leaned back in my squeaky IKEA office chair, savoring every note of terror in Miranda's voice. 3 weeks had passed since that humiliating evening at Meridian Restaurant, where the Wellington family had spent 2 hours systematically dismantling my self-worth with surgical precision. 3 weeks since Victoria had smiled that patronizing smile while explaining how grassroots entrepreneurs, like me, were so charmingly authentic. 3 weeks since Harrison had chuckled about people who tried to compete in sophisticated markets while winging it. And 3 weeks since Miranda had expressed her deep respect for those who succeeded without proper educational advantages, making me sound like some kind of inspiring charity case. "I'm sorry, Miranda," I said calmly, examining my fingernails with deliberate casualness. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. Could you be more specific about which investments you're talking about?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear her breathing through the phone. When she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped to a whisper, as if she were afraid someone might overhear her admitting the scope of their crisis. "April, please don't play games with me right now. We know it was you. The timing, the amount, everything matches up perfectly. You somehow pulled out $250 million from our fund, and you've triggered a complete liquidity crisis. We have 12 portfolio companies waiting for funding rounds that we can no longer support. Our credit lines are frozen. The board is calling emergency meetings. My mother hasn't slept in 2 days." I took a sip of my regular grocery store coffee, the same Folgers blend that had been my morning routine for years. Through my home office window, I could see Mrs. Chin watering her garden, probably thinking about her upcoming mortgage payment like any normal person would. The contrast was almost surreal. Here I was, wearing Benjamin's old hoodie and fuzzy slippers, having just orchestrated the financial destruction of one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious venture capital dynasties. "Miranda, I think there might be some confusion here," I continued, keeping my tone professionally neutral. "I run a small AI consulting business. I help startups with machine learning integration. I'm not sure how I could possibly be connected to the kind of institutional investments you're describing." This was the moment I had been planning for 3 weeks, ever since I walked out of that restaurant feeling smaller and more humiliated than I had in years. The Wellington family's systematic cruelty had been masterful in its execution, every comment carefully crafted to sound supportive while delivering maximum psychological damage. They had treated me like an amusing specimen, something to be studied and discussed rather than respected as an equal human being. But they had made one fatal mistake. In their arrogance, they had never bothered to research who they were actually dealing with. Their assumption that a state school graduate working from a home office couldn't possibly pose any real threat had blinded them to the reality sitting across their dinner table. They had been so confident in their superiority, so certain of their ability to identify worth based on superficial credentials, that they never imagined the woman they were dismissing controlled enough capital to end their careers. "April, please," Miranda's voice was breaking now, and I could hear what sounded like crying in the background. "We know you're not just a consultant. Our forensic accountants traced the withdrawals to a series of shell companies that all lead back to Rodriguez Holdings. You've been one of our largest limited partners for 8 years. How is that even possible?" I had to admire Michelle's work. My private wealth manager had structured my investments through a complex web of international holdings that would have impressed the most sophisticated forensic accountants. For nearly a decade, the Wellington family had been living off my money without ever knowing my name appeared anywhere in their investor documentation. Their fund's stability, their portfolio's success, their family's entire reputation, all of it had been built on capital provided by the woman they had just spent an evening treating like intellectual livestock. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted. Here was Miranda Wellington, the golden daughter who had inherited every advantage Silicon Valley could provide, begging for mercy from someone she had dismissed as educationally inferior just 3 weeks earlier. The woman who had expressed such touching respect for people who succeeded without proper advantages, was now discovering that one of those people had been bankrolling her family's empire for years. "I'm really not sure what you want me to say, Miranda," I replied, allowing just a hint of confusion to creep into my voice. "If there's been some kind of investor withdrawal from your fund, that sounds like something you should be discussing with your limited partners, not with someone who helps startups optimize their algorithms." The consulting business had started as genuine work, a way to stay connected to the ground-level reality of building companies while my investment portfolio grew in the background. Over the years, it had evolved into something more valuable than money. It was my cover story, my explanation for why April Rodriguez could afford a comfortable lifestyle without raising suspicions about hidden wealth. Every client meeting, every project proposal, every modest invoice had been carefully designed to create a believable narrative about my success. My home office reflected this same deliberate modesty. The furniture might have come from IKEA, but the laptop sitting on my cheap desk contained access to investment portfolios that could influence global markets. The squeaky chair that announced every movement was positioned in front of monitors that displayed real-time data from quantum computing ventures in Switzerland and biotech companies revolutionizing cancer treatment in Germany. Every morning I reviewed reports on companies that were reshaping entire industries, while working from a room that looked like it belonged to any struggling consultant. "The board wants to meet with you," Miranda said finally, her voice hollow with defeat. "Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. They're calling it an emergency session to discuss fund stability, but we all know it's really about damage control. Will you come?" I pretended to consider this request, as if my schedule of small consulting clients might conflict with salvaging their billion-dollar fund. The truth was, I had been waiting for this invitation since the moment I instructed Michelle to begin the withdrawal process. This meeting would be my opportunity to watch the Wellington family's century-old legacy crumble in real time, their arrogance finally meeting its consequences in the most expensive way possible. "I suppose I could rearrange some client calls," I said generously. "But I have to say, I'm still not entirely clear on why my presence would be helpful in your board meeting. Venture capital fund management is quite outside my area of expertise." The sound Miranda made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "April, please. We know who you are now. We know what you're worth. We know what you can do to us. The question is what it's going to take to make this right." And there it was, the admission I had been waiting for. The acknowledgement that their precious Stanford MBAs and family connections meant nothing when faced with real financial power. The recognition that the woman they had dismissed as intellectually inferior actually held their professional lives in her hands. After years of operating in the shadows, carefully maintaining my cover as a modest consultant, the Wellington family had finally discovered that true success whispers while fake success screams. Tomorrow's board meeting would be the culmination of everything I had been building toward. But tonight I was going to finish my grocery store coffee, order takeout for dinner with Benjamin, and savor the knowledge that sometimes, justice comes with compound interest. The call with Miranda ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone in the sudden silence of my home office. But my mind wasn't focused on the conversation anymore. It was traveling back to everything I knew about the Wellington family, the dynasty I had just brought to its knees. Understanding your enemy was crucial in any battle, and I had been studying these people for far longer than they realized. Victoria Wellington's corner office on Sand Hill Road was legendary in Silicon Valley circles, though I had never seen it personally until this week's crisis meetings. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the venture capital ecosystem's beating heart, where billion-dollar decisions were made daily over $15 salads and artisanal coffee that cost more than most people's hourly wage. Victoria had positioned her desk strategically. Visitors would enter to find her silhouetted against the backdrop of the tech world's most influential address, an unconscious power play that reinforced her dominance before conversations even began. At 58, Victoria commanded a level of respect that few women in venture capital had achieved. She hadn't inherited her position or married into influence. She had clawed her way to the top through a combination of ruthless intelligence, calculated risk-taking, and an almost supernatural ability to identify promising startups before they became household names. Her track record was genuinely impressive, She had led early-stage investments in 3 companies that later became unicorns, each exit generating returns that cemented her reputation as one of the Valley's most successful investors. But Victoria's success came with a price that she wore like expensive armor. Every Stanford MBA reference, every casual mention of her professors who now ran Fortune 500 companies, every perfectly timed name drop of a classmate's latest IPO, these weren't just conversation. They were weapons in an ongoing war to prove she belonged in a world that had initially questioned her worthiness. She had internalized the very system that had once excluded her, becoming its most zealous enforcer. I had watched Victoria operate at industry events over the years, observing from the sidelines as she worked the room with surgical precision. She possessed an uncanny ability to assess someone's value within seconds of meeting them, categorizing people into useful contacts, potential threats, or dismissible nobodies based on criteria that went far beyond actual achievement. Her conversations followed predictable patterns: establish credentials, assess mutual connections, determine potential value, then either invest time or politely extract herself. The irony was that Victoria's greatest strength had become her fatal weakness. Her pattern recognition skills, so valuable in identifying promising startups, had created blind spots in human assessment that I had exploited perfectly. When she looked at me across that dinner table 3 weeks ago, her mental algorithms had processed state school graduate and modest consultant and automatically categorized me as irrelevant. The possibility that someone outside her prescribed success framework could pose any real threat simply didn't compute in her worldview. Harrison Wellington represented a different kind of Silicon Valley success story, the graceful transition from primary player to influential supporter. 20 years ago he had been building his own tech companies, achieving moderate success in enterprise software before the dot-com crash taught him valuable lessons about timing and market forces. When Victoria's star began rising in venture capital, Harrison had made a strategic decision that many successful men struggle with. He chose to be genuinely supportive rather than competitive. This transition had required considerable ego management, but Harrison had mastered it with the same strategic thinking he had once applied to building companies. He redirected his energy into managing their personal investments, a role that actually leveraged his operational experience more effectively than venture capital ever could. While Victoria focused on finding the next big thing, Harrison optimized their existing portfolio, managed their real estate holdings, and cultivated the social connections that kept their family positioned at the center of Silicon Valley's power structure. Harrison's true genius lay in his ability to make everyone feel important while subtly reinforcing his family's influence. At their famous Atherton Mansion networking events, he would introduce a struggling entrepreneur to exactly the right investor, broker a conversation between a founder and a potential acquisition target, or suggest a Stanford connection that could open crucial doors. People left these gatherings feeling grateful for Harrison's generosity, never quite realizing how each introduction served to strengthen the Wellington family's position as essential connectors in the Valley's ecosystem. But Harrison's networking prowess had created its own form of tunnel vision. He collected interesting people the way others collected art, always evaluating potential value through the lens of existing connections and established credentials. A state school graduate working from a home office simply didn't register as worth collecting, regardless of their actual capabilities or hidden resources. His dismissal of me at dinner hadn't been personal. It was the automatic response of someone whose social radar was calibrated to detect only familiar frequencies of success. Miranda Wellington represented the third generation of the family's evolution, a perfect fusion of inherited advantages and genuine capability. At 28, she possessed everything Silicon Valley valued: Stanford credentials, family connections, natural intelligence, and the kind of confidence that came from never having experienced real failure. Her success wasn't accidental. She had worked genuinely hard, made smart investment decisions, and earned her position through actual merit rather than pure nepotism. Miranda's Instagram feed told the story of a life lived at the intersection of privilege and achievement. Photos from exclusive startup conferences, casual selfies with billionaire founders, behind-the-scenes shots from IPO celebrations, each post carefully curated to display access and influence while maintaining the illusion of effortless success. She had mastered the art of humble bragging, presenting her extraordinary opportunities as normal experiences while inspiring envy and admiration from her carefully cultivated audience. As a junior partner at TechFlow Ventures, Miranda had already led investments in 3 companies that achieved successful exits, generating returns that validated her decision-making abilities and earning respect from senior partners who had initially questioned her readiness for responsibility. Her investment thesis focused on early-stage companies led by founders who reminded her of herself, young, credentialed, well-connected entrepreneurs with ambitious visions and the background to execute them. But Miranda's success had never been tested by real adversity. Every challenge she had faced came with built-in advantages: family resources to cushion failures, connections to provide second chances, and a reputation that opened doors even after mistakes. She had never encountered someone who could genuinely threaten her position, never faced an opponent who operated outside the rules she understood. Her confidence, so valuable in high-stakes negotiations with entrepreneurs and co-investors, had never been challenged by someone who could actually destroy everything she had built. The Wellington family's dinner conversations revealed the philosophical foundation underlying their success. These weren't casual family meals. They were strategic planning sessions disguised as social gatherings. Victoria would share insights from recent pitch meetings, Harrison would report on industry gossip and personnel changes, and Miranda would update them on her portfolio company's progress. Together, they would analyze market trends, discuss upcoming opportunities, and coordinate their family's positioning for maximum advantage. Their worldview rested on 3 unshakable pillars. Elite education provided the intellectual framework for understanding complex markets, powerful connections offered access to exclusive opportunities, and generational wealth enabled the kind of patient capital deployment that generated superior returns. This wasn't just their investment philosophy, it was their explanation for why they deserved their success while others struggled. They had convinced themselves that their advantages were actually superior capabilities, transforming inherited privilege into evidence of personal merit. This belief system created a self-reinforcing cycle that validated their prejudices while blinding them to alternative paths to success. Every successful investment in a Stanford-educated founder confirmed their thesis about educational pedigree. Every failed pitch from someone outside their network reinforced their conviction about the importance of proper connections. Every portfolio company that struggled without adequate capital proved their point about the necessity of generational wealth. But their greatest vulnerability lay in the certainty of their assessments. The Wellington family believed they could instantly recognize worth based on superficial markers, never imagining that real power might choose to remain hidden. Their filters had become so refined, so perfectly calibrated to their narrow definition of success, that they had become incapable of recognizing threats that didn't announce themselves according to their established patterns. They were about to learn that their most dangerous enemy had been hiding in plain sight, wearing the wrong clothes and claiming the wrong educational background while secretly controlling their financial destiny. The irony of their certainty would have been amusing if it wasn't about to cost them everything they had built. But understanding the Wellington family's blind spots was only half the equation. The other half was Benjamin's unwitting role in orchestrating their downfall. The conversation that would eventually trigger the $250 million earthquake started on an ordinary Tuesday evening in March. Benjamin burst through our front door with the kind of infectious energy that usually meant he'd solved a particularly challenging coding problem at work. He practically bounced as he hung up his jacket, and I could see the excitement radiating from him even before he said a word. "You'll never guess who asked about you today," he said, sliding into the kitchen chair across from me with a grin that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. His enthusiasm was genuine and completely innocent. Benjamin had no idea he was about to set in motion the destruction of his own family's legacy. "Miranda called me at work," he continued, reaching for the leftover pizza I had heated up for dinner. "She's been curious about your AI consulting business ever since Mom mentioned it at Sunday brunch last month. Apparently, TechFlow is looking at some machine learning startups, and Miranda thought you might have valuable insights about the technical implementation challenges they're facing." I felt my stomach tighten, but Benjamin was too excited to notice my reaction. He had been trying for months to find ways to integrate me more fully into his family's world, never understanding that I preferred to remain on the periphery for very specific reasons. His love for me was so genuine, so uncomplicated by the status games that dominated Silicon Valley, that he couldn't imagine his family might view me as anything other than a valuable addition to their network. "She wants to set up a dinner," Benjamin said, taking a bite of pizza while gesticulating with his free hand. Maybe this weekend? She thinks you could really benefit from meeting Victoria and Harrison too. Mom has connections throughout the tech industry. She could introduce you to potential clients, maybe even some investors who could help you scale your consulting business. The painful irony of his suggestion hit me like a physical force. Here was my husband, genuinely excited about helping me grow a business that served as cover for an investment empire that already dwarfed his family's fund. Benjamin truly believed that his aunt's connections could benefit my modest consulting operation, never imagining that I was already one of TechFlow's largest limited partners. His innocence was both heartbreaking and dangerous. That's really thoughtful of Miranda, I managed, forcing enthusiasm into my voice while my mind raced through the implications. Did she mention what kind of insights she was looking for? Benjamin's face lit up even brighter. She was asking about AI implementation challenges in early-stage companies. Apparently, they're seeing a lot of startups with amazing algorithms but terrible execution strategies. She thought your experience helping companies integrate machine learning could give TechFlow a competitive advantage in evaluating technical teams. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Benjamin outlining Miranda's vision for how this introduction could benefit everyone involved. His excitement was infectious and completely genuine. He saw this as an opportunity to help both his wife's business and his family's fund, never suspecting that the two were already intimately connected in ways that would horrify him if he knew the truth. As the week progressed, Benjamin threw himself into planning this introduction with the same methodical approach he applied to software development. He researched restaurants, considered timing, and even started coaching me on conversation topics that might interest his family. His preparation was touching in its thoroughness and devastating in its naivety. Meanwhile, I found myself caught in an increasingly complex web of deception. Each evening, Benjamin would update me on his coordination calls with Miranda, sharing details about his family's excitement to meet me and their growing expectations for what this dinner might accomplish. I nodded and smiled while internally cataloging every piece of information that confirmed my worst fears about how this meeting would unfold. The research I conducted through Michelle painted a clear picture of what I was walking into. TechFlow Ventures' recent interviews and public statements revealed a family deeply committed to their own version of meritocracy, one that prioritized elite education, established connections and cultural fit above actual achievement. Victoria's quotes in TechCrunch about backing founders with the right background for global scaling weren't just investment philosophy, they were declarations of war against anyone who didn't fit their narrow template of acceptable success. Miranda's social media presence told an equally revealing story. Her LinkedIn posts about supporting diverse entrepreneurs were carefully crafted to sound inclusive while actually reinforcing existing hierarchies. When she wrote about backing founders from all backgrounds, the accompanying photos invariably featured Stanford graduates from wealthy families. Her definition of diversity seemed to extend only to people who looked different but shared identical educational and social credentials. The restaurant selection confirmed my suspicions about the evening's true purpose. When Benjamin mentioned that Miranda had chosen Meridian, I immediately understood the strategic thinking behind the decision. This wasn't just a family dinner. It was a carefully orchestrated evaluation designed to establish dominance from the moment I walked through the door. Meridian represented everything I despised about Silicon Valley's performative wealth culture. The minimalist design was calculated to intimidate anyone unfamiliar with high-end dining. The molecular gastronomy menu served as an instant litmus test for cultural sophistication. Even the wine list was curated to separate insiders from outsiders, featuring obscure vintages that required extensive knowledge to navigate successfully. But the Wellingtons had chosen their battlefield without realizing they were granting me home field advantage. While they saw Meridian as their natural habitat, I saw it as an expensive stage where their performance of superiority would be captured in perfect detail for my future revenge. Every patronizing comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of calculated condescension would be witnessed by the very people they were trying to impress. My preparation through Michelle revealed the full scope of what was at stake. The detailed financial reports she compiled showed that my investment in TechFlow represented not just 40% of their current fund, but also the cornerstone of their entire portfolio strategy. They had used my capital as collateral for leveraged investments, foundation for their credit lines, and justification for their most aggressive deals. Removing my money wouldn't just hurt their returns, it would trigger a cascading collapse that would destroy their reputation throughout Silicon Valley. The contingency plans Michelle prepared gave me multiple options for revenge, each calibrated to inflict maximum damage while maintaining legal protection. We could withdraw funds gradually, creating slow burn pressure that would force increasingly desperate decisions. We could liquidate positions strategically, timing our exits to coincide with their most vulnerable portfolio companies. Or we could execute a coordinated withdrawal designed to trigger immediate liquidity crisis, maximum panic and complete professional destruction. By Saturday evening I had chosen the nuclear option. The Wellington family's certainty about their ability to assess worth based on superficial credentials was about to meet the most expensive education of their lives. They would sit across from someone they dismissed as intellectually inferior while that same person held their financial destiny in her hands. The final irony was that Benjamin's genuine love and support had created the perfect conditions for his family's downfall. His enthusiasm for introducing me to his relatives stemmed from his authentic belief that I deserved recognition and opportunity. He had no way of knowing that his efforts to help my small consulting business would expose his family's prejudices in exactly the way needed to justify their complete destruction. As I prepared for dinner, I realized that this evening would change everything, not just for the Wellington family, but for my own carefully constructed double life. Win or lose, after tonight, April Rodriguez, the modest consultant, would be impossible to maintain. The transformation from concerned preparation to actual lived nightmare began the moment Benjamin and I stepped through Meridian's glass doors. Saturday evening, 7:30 sharp, and the Wellington family was already seated at their preferred corner table, positioned strategically to survey the entire restaurant while remaining partially hidden behind an abstract sculpture that probably cost more than most people's cars. Victoria rose first, her movements precise and calculated like a chess player opening with a predetermined strategy. She was dressed in what I recognized as understated power dressing, a charcoal blazer that whispered expensive rather than shouting it, jewelry that suggested wealth without vulgarity, and that particular shade of confident smile that successful women wore when they were about to demonstrate their superiority to lesser mortals. "April," she said, extending her hand with the kind of measured warmth that felt like being evaluated by a job interviewer. "Benjamin has told us so much about you. We're absolutely thrilled to finally meet the woman who's captured our boy's heart." The word, captured, hung in the air with just enough emphasis to suggest something predatory, as if I had somehow ensnared their precious family member through cunning rather than genuine connection. Harrison's handshake followed immediately after, firm but brief, accompanied by the kind of searching look that suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense to him. Miranda's greeting was the most revealing. Her smile was bright and seemingly genuine, but her eyes conducted a rapid assessment that took in my outfit, my posture, my handbag, and my overall presentation in approximately 3 seconds. I watched her mental calculator working, placing me somewhere between disappointing but tolerable and how did this happen, on whatever scale she used to evaluate people. "So," Victoria said before we had even settled into our chairs, "Benjamin tells us you run some kind of consulting business. How exciting. It must be so rewarding to work with all those eager young entrepreneurs." The tone was perfectly calibrated, enthusiastic enough to sound supportive, but with just enough condescension to make it clear that she considered my work something between a hobby and charity work. The phrase, eager young entrepreneurs, suggested people playing at business rather than building real companies. "I help startups integrate AI into their business models," I replied, keeping my voice steady while internally bracing for what I knew was coming. "Machine learning implementation, algorithm optimization, that sort of thing." Miranda's laugh came immediately, a sound like crystal breaking that she tried to disguise as delighted amusement. "Oh, that's wonderful. Like technical support but for artificial intelligence. How very hands-on of you." The comparison to technical support was deliberate and devastating. In Silicon Valley's hierarchy, technical support occupied the bottom rung, necessary but definitely not strategic, tactical rather than visionary. Miranda had just relegated 8 years of sophisticated consulting work to the level of helping people reset their passwords. Harrison leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone watching a moderately entertaining performance. "And where did you develop this expertise, April? Your educational background must be fascinating." The question arrived like a guided missile, perfectly aimed at what they had already identified as my primary vulnerability. I could feel Benjamin tense slightly beside me, suddenly aware that this conversation was developing an edge he hadn't anticipated. "I went to state," I said simply, watching their faces process this information with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. "Computer science degree, then straight into the workforce." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ambient noise from other tables, the gentle clinking of expensive silverware, the murmur of conversations about IPOs and acquisitions, the soft sounds of Silicon Valley's elite conducting their weekend social business. At our table, 3 of the Valley's most successful people were struggling to process how someone with my educational pedigree had ended up in their presence. "State school," Victoria repeated slowly, as if she were a linguist encountering a previously unknown dialect. Her eyebrows had climbed so high they threatened to disappear entirely into her perfectly styled hair. How very practical of you." The word practical carried the same weight that others might use for tragic or unfortunate. In Victoria's worldview, practical was what people chose when they couldn't achieve prestigious. It was the consolation prize for those who lacked the intelligence, connections, or family resources to aim higher. Miranda exchanged a look with her father that I wasn't supposed to notice, one of those silent family communications that said everything about their assessment of the situation. The look conveyed disappointment, confusion, and a growing understanding that their evening was not going to unfold as pleasantly as they had hoped. "Well," Harrison said finally, clearing his throat with the kind of diplomatic cough that probably served him well in awkward board meetings, "there's certainly something to be said for the grassroots approach to education. Very authentic." Authentic. The word hit me like a slap disguised as a compliment. In Silicon Valley speak, authentic was what people called things that were genuine but ultimately inferior, like farmers' markets compared to Whole Foods, or craft beer compared to fine wine. It was a way of acknowledging value while simultaneously establishing hierarchy. The systematic destruction of my dignity continued through the wine selection, where Harrison took control with the kind of casual expertise that demonstrated both knowledge and access. He didn't consult the sommelier so much as conduct a brief conversation between equals, discussing vintages and regions with the fluency of someone whose cellar probably contained bottles worth more than my supposed annual income. "I think we'll start with the 2019 Chassagne Montrachet," Harrison decided, mentioning the selection with the casual confidence of someone who knew the wine cost more than most people's monthly car payments. "April, I hope you enjoy white Burgundy? Or would you prefer something a bit more approachable?" The word approachable was another perfectly aimed insult, suggesting that my palate might not be sophisticated enough to appreciate their selection. It was an invitation to reveal my inadequacy by asking for something simpler, more common, more suited to my presumed background. "The Chassagne Montrachet sounds perfect," I replied, having spent enough time in high-end restaurants through my actual business dealings to recognize both the wine and the test. "I appreciate good Burgundy." Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of micro-expression that suggested surprise at my response. She had been expecting me to stumble, to reveal my unfamiliarity with expensive wine, to provide evidence that supported their preconceptions about my sophistication level. "Wonderful," she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "We so rarely meet people who truly appreciate the finer things. It's refreshing to discover that Benjamin has found someone who shares his elevated tastes." The pause before elevated tastes was loaded with meaning. She was crediting Benjamin with sophisticated preferences while simultaneously expressing amazement that someone like me could meet his standards. The compliment was designed to sting, praising my husband while implying that his choice in wives represented a significant compromise. As our wines arrived and the conversation continued, I realized that every exchange was being carefully orchestrated to establish and reinforce their superiority. They weren't just making conversation. They were conducting a systematic demolition of my self-worth, using the kind of sophisticated cruelty that could only come from people who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of social dominance. Miranda launched into a detailed description of her recent trip to a private equity conference in Switzerland, name-dropping billionaire investors and exclusive events with the casual frequency of someone reading a grocery list. Victoria contributed stories about board meetings with companies I recognized as household names, speaking about CEOs and founders as if they were personal friends rather than professional contacts. Harrison's contributions focused on their social calendar, charity galas where tables cost more than most people's annual salaries, private dinners with tech luminaries, exclusive events that required both invitation and significant social standing to attend. Together, they painted a picture of a world where real business happened at altitude far above anything I could possibly understand or access. The message was clear. They existed in a realm of influence and sophistication that people like me could never enter, no matter how hard we tried or how successful we became within our limited sphere. They were generously allowing me to glimpse their world, but I should never mistake that glimpse for actual belonging. By Saturday evening, as Benjamin and I drove home from that catastrophic dinner, my humiliation had crystallized into something far more dangerous than anger. It had become calculation. I spent the rest of the weekend in my home office, ostensibly catching up on client work while actually replaying every moment of systematic cruelty I had endured. Each dismissive comment, every patronizing smile, Victoria's casual reference to my authentic grassroots approach, all of it was being catalogued and processed through the lens of someone who possessed the power to destroy everything they had built. Sunday morning arrived with unusual clarity. I woke up before my alarm, Benjamin still sleeping peacefully beside me, completely unaware that his wife was planning the financial assassination of his family's empire. The decision had formed overnight with the inevitability of a mathematical proof. The Wellington family needed to learn that their inherited privilege meant absolutely nothing when confronted with real financial power. At exactly 9 a.m. Pacific time, I dialed Michelle's direct line, knowing she would be in her downtown office reviewing overnight market movements from Asia and preparing for the week's trading sessions. Michelle had been managing my portfolio for 8 years, watching it grow from a modest $500,000 startup fund into a $250 million investment empire. She understood better than anyone the magnitude of what I was about to request. "Michelle, it's April," I said, settling into my squeaky office chair while staring out at Mrs. Chen's garden, where normal people worried about normal things like watering schedules and mortgage payments. "I need you to liquidate everything we have in TechFlow Ventures. Every fund, every investment, every single penny. I want it all moved to our Swiss partners within 10 business days." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds, broken only by the sound of Michelle's sharp intake of breath. She had helped me build this portfolio from nothing, celebrating each successful exit and reinvestment with the kind of professional pride that came from watching careful strategy pay off exponentially. She also understood exactly what removing $250 million from TechFlow's operations would do to their fund structure. "April," she said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just been asked to trigger a financial earthquake that represents approximately 40% of their total assets under management. "Withdrawing that amount simultaneously will create massive liquidity pressures across their entire portfolio. Are you absolutely certain about this?" "Completely certain," I replied, watching a hummingbird hover over Mrs. Chen's flower bed with the kind of focused intensity one was now applying to the Wellington family's destruction. "They need to learn that their century of inherited privilege doesn't protect them from the consequences of their own arrogance." Michelle's professionalism kicked in immediately, shifting from shock to strategic planning with the efficiency that had made her one of Silicon Valley's most trusted wealth managers. "I'll need to coordinate with our banking partners in Zurich and London to handle currency exchanges without triggering market alerts. The documentation alone will require coordination across 3 time zones. This is going to be the largest single asset transfer we've ever executed." Over the following week, Michelle worked with surgical precision that would have impressed military strategists. Each day brought carefully orchestrated movements of capital that flew beneath TechFlow's radar while systematically dismantling their financial foundation. Millions of dollars moved through international banking channels with the quiet efficiency of a precision strike, leaving no traces that could warn the Wellington family of the coming devastation. Michelle called me every evening with progress reports, her voice growing more amazed as she calculated the ripple effects this withdrawal would create throughout Silicon Valley's interconnected investment ecosystem. "They've been using your capital as collateral for leveraged positions across their entire portfolio," she explained during Tuesday's update. "When your funds clear our systems on Friday, they're going to face margin calls on investments worth nearly twice your original commitment." Wednesday morning brought the first signs that TechFlow's systems were beginning to register unusual activity. Benjamin's phone started buzzing before 7 a.m., Miranda's name flashing on the screen with increasing urgency. When he finally answered, still groggy from sleep, I could hear her voice from across our bedroom, high-pitched, frantic, barely coherent, as she explained some kind of major investor crisis that was triggering alerts throughout their fund management systems. I don't understand, Benjamin said, sitting up in bed with the confused expression of someone whose peaceful morning had just been shattered. You're saying someone pulled out hundreds of millions of dollars? Who has that kind of money? I maintained perfect composure, sipping my coffee while listening to Miranda's increasingly desperate explanations about liquidity pressures and emergency board meetings. Benjamin kept glancing at me with bewilderment, unable to comprehend why his family's business crisis might have anything to do with his wife's modest consulting work. The disconnect between his perception of my capabilities and the reality of what I had just orchestrated was almost amusing. Miranda's questioning became more pointed as the conversation continued. She demanded to know if I had any connections to large investment firms or family offices that might have suddenly decided to withdraw funding from TechFlow. Benjamin's responses revealed the complete innocence that had made him such an unwitting accomplice in his family's downfall. He genuinely had no idea that his wife possessed the financial resources to single-handedly destroy a venture capital fund. By Thursday afternoon, Miranda had apparently connected enough dots to bypass Benjamin entirely and call me directly. Her previous condescension had been completely replaced by raw terror, her voice cracking with emotion as she struggled to process what was happening to her family's empire. "What the hell did you do?" she screamed before I could even say hello, all pretense of Silicon Valley sophistication stripped away by panic. "You moved $250 million. $250 million. Do you have any idea what you've done to us?" Hearing those numbers spoken aloud by the woman who had dismissed my little hobby investments just 4 days earlier provided satisfaction that exceeded my wildest expectations. Miranda's voice continued to crack as she explained the cascading consequences of my withdrawal margin calls on leveraged positions, forced liquidations of other investments, emergency meetings with banking partners who were demanding additional collateral. "We had that capital committed to 12 different portfolio companies," she continued, her professional composure completely shattered. 3 of them were supposed to close Series B rounds next week. Without that funding, they're going to miss their milestones, which means they'll miss their valuations, which means our entire quarterly projections are destroyed. The desperation in her voice was music to my ears, each word confirming that my revenge was unfolding exactly as Michelle and I had calculated. But Miranda wasn't finished. She was begging now, promising that her family would make amends for any misunderstandings, offering concessions and apologies with the frantic energy of someone watching their world collapse in real time. "Please, April, you have to understand, this isn't just about our fund. We have obligations to limited partners, commitments to founders, responsibilities to employees who depend on us for their livelihoods. Whatever we did wrong, whatever offended you, we can fix it. But you have to give us time to unwind these positions properly." Michelle's evening update confirmed that TechFlow's crisis was deepening with mathematical precision. Portfolio companies were demanding explanations for delayed funding rounds. Limited partners were calling emergency meetings to assess their exposure. Investment banks were downgrading TechFlow's credit ratings and demanding additional collateral for existing loans. Their entire fund structure was built on the assumption that your capital would remain stable, Michelle explained, her voice carrying professional admiration for the completeness of our financial strike. "Without that foundation, everything else is collapsing like a house of cards. They'll be lucky if they can avoid a complete liquidation of the fund." As Thursday evening turned into Friday morning, I realized that the Wellington family's carefully constructed empire was crumbling with the exact same systematic precision they had applied to destroying my dignity just 1 week earlier. The only difference was that their weapon had been words, while mine was money, and money, as they were discovering, was infinitely more powerful than inherited privilege when the stakes were survival itself. The weekend passed in a strange state of suspended animation, broken only by Benjamin's increasingly concerned phone calls from his family members. By Sunday evening, he was fielding crisis communications every few hours, each call revealing another layer of TechFlow's accelerating collapse. I maintained my facade of supportive concern while internally counting down the hours until Monday's inevitable reckoning. Friday morning's call came at 8:15, just as I was finishing my first cup of coffee. The voice belonged to Victoria Wellington's executive assistant, and despite her obvious training in professional communication, I could hear the barely contained panic threading through every carefully chosen word. Ms. Rodriguez? This is Catherine calling from TechFlow Ventures. Mrs. Wellington has asked me to reach out regarding an urgent board meeting that's been called for this morning. The board would very much appreciate your presence to discuss recent developments affecting fund stability. The phrase recent developments was beautifully euphemistic, a corporate way of saying that their entire world was collapsing and they suspected I might be holding the detonator. Catherine's voice trembled slightly as she provided the address and stressed the critical importance of my immediate attendance. I'll need to rearrange some client calls, I replied, maintaining the pretense that my modest consulting schedule might conflict with salvaging their billion-dollar empire. But I suppose I can make myself available. The relief in Catherine's voice was palpable. Thank you so much, Ms. Rodriguez. Mrs. Wellington will be deeply grateful for your time. An hour later, I stood outside TechFlow Ventures' glass headquarters building, taking a moment to appreciate the irony of the situation. This gleaming monument to Silicon Valley success had been built on capital that included my investments, funded by money earned through the very consulting work they had dismissed as insignificant just 1 week earlier. The scene inside resembled a financial war zone. Employees clustered in worried groups throughout the normally pristine lobby, their hushed conversations creating an undercurrent of barely controlled panic. I caught fragments of phrases: emergency liquidation, margin calls, and massive investor withdrawal, that confirmed Michelle's reports about the cascading crisis my departure had triggered. Catherine greeted me at the elevator bank, and I could see that she hadn't slept properly in days. Her usually perfect makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she pressed the button for the executive floor. During our brief ride upward, she kept glancing at me with the kind of desperate hope usually reserved for people meeting potential organ donors. The boardroom occupied TechFlow's top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of Sand Hill Road and the venture capital ecosystem that the Wellington family had once dominated. But the atmosphere inside felt more like a funeral parlor than a celebration of financial power. Victoria Wellington rose from her position at the head of the polished conference table, and the transformation was stunning. The confident woman who had systematically destroyed my dignity 5 days earlier had been replaced by someone who looked like she had aged a decade in less than a week. Her usually immaculate appearance showed unmistakable signs of stress, wrinkled clothing that suggested she had slept in her office, slightly disheveled hair that betrayed the shaking hands she was trying to control, and dark circles under eyes that probably hadn't seen peaceful sleep since Wednesday's crisis began. Ms. Rodriguez, she began, her voice carefully modulated but carrying an unmistakable undertone of desperation, thank you so much for making time in your schedule to join us. I believe there may have been some misunderstandings during our recent dinner. The word misunderstandings hung in the air like a white flag of surrender. This was Victoria Wellington, the woman who had built her reputation on never backing down from difficult negotiations, now reduced to begging someone she had dismissed as intellectually inferior just days earlier. Miranda sat to her mother's right, looking like she had been crying intermittently for hours. Her usual confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the hollow-eyed expression of someone watching everything they had worked for crumble in real time. Harrison occupied his traditional supporting role, but even his diplomatic skills seemed inadequate for the magnitude of their current crisis. Victoria, I replied calmly, settling into the chair they indicated while maintaining perfect composure, I'm not sure what kind of misunderstandings you're referring to. Could you be more specific? Before Victoria could respond, the boardroom door opened with perfect dramatic timing. James Morrison entered with the kind of authoritative presence that automatically shifted the room's power dynamics. As chairman of TechFlow's board, James commanded respect throughout Silicon Valley's investment community, but his relationship with me went far deeper than most people realized. April, James said warmly, crossing the room to shake my hand with genuine respect and familiarity, what an unexpected surprise to see you here. The effect on the Wellington family was immediate and devastating. Victoria's face drained of what little color it had retained, while Miranda actually gasped audibly. Harrison's diplomatic composure finally cracked completely, revealing the shock underneath as he processed the implications of James's greeting. James, I replied with equal warmth. Always a pleasure. Though I have to admit, I'm still not entirely clear on why my presence was requested for this meeting. James's smile carried just enough edge to suggest he understood exactly why I was there and found the situation appropriately ironic. He had been my business partner in international biotech investments for nearly 6 years, collaborating on deals that moved more capital across borders than most countries' annual GDP. He knew better than anyone the scope of my actual capabilities and resources. Well, James said, settling into his chair at the head of the table while maintaining eye contact with Victoria, I believe Mrs. Wellington was hoping to discuss some recent investor relations challenges that have created liquidity pressures for the fund. Victoria's hands were visibly trembling now as she attempted to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond her management capabilities. James, I think we need to address some irregularities in our investor reporting systems. It seems there may have been some confusion about the identity of some of our limited partners. James's expression shifted subtly, taking on the kind of professional seriousness that indicated heads were about to roll. Irregularities? That's a strong word, Victoria. Perhaps you could be more specific about what kind of confusion you're referring to. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Victoria found the courage to continue. It appears that Ms. Rodriguez may have been investing in our fund through entities that weren't properly identified in our partner communications. We've discovered that she represents a significantly larger stake in TechFlow than anyone realized. Significantly larger, James repeated slowly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was about to deliver devastating news. Victoria, Ms. Rodriguez has been one of our anchor investors for nearly 8 years. Her commitment represents approximately 40% of our current fund's capital base. The numbers hit the room like physical blows. Miranda made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, while Harrison appeared to be calculating the implications with the horrified fascination of someone watching a natural disaster unfold in slow motion. James continued with methodical precision, systematically destroying every assumption the Wellington family had made about my capabilities and resources. Ms. Rodriguez and I have co-invested in biotech ventures across 3 continents, moving more capital through international markets than most sovereign wealth funds manage annually. With each revelation, I watched the Wellington family's worldview crumble like a building under controlled demolition. Their certainty about their ability to assess worth based on educational credentials was being destroyed by the reality of someone who had quietly accumulated more power than they could comprehend. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, James said, his voice cutting through the boardroom's stunned silence with surgical precision. You treated one of our most valuable investors with disrespect because you assumed her educational background made her unqualified to understand venture capital? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and utterly damning. James's tone had shifted from professional concern to barely controlled anger as he processed the magnitude of their failure. The consequences are immediate and final, James announced with the authority of someone whose decision could not be appealed. Victoria, you'll be stepping down as managing partner effective today. Miranda, your junior partner position is terminated immediately. This family's association with TechFlow Ventures ends now. As I watched their faces process this professional execution, I felt satisfaction that transcended mere revenge. This was justice served with compound interest, the perfect mathematical conclusion to their systematic cruelty. The silence in the boardroom stretched for what felt like an eternity after James delivered his final judgment. Victoria's face had gone completely white, her hands gripping the edge of the conference table as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Miranda was crying openly now, tears streaming down her cheeks as the reality of her terminated career sank in. Harrison sat frozen, his diplomatic skills utterly useless in the face of such complete professional destruction. There will be a press release issued within the hour, James continued, his voice carrying the finality of a judge reading a death sentence. TechFlow Ventures is announcing a complete restructuring of senior management due to failures in investor relations and fund oversight. The board has lost all confidence in the current leadership's ability to maintain the fiduciary standards our limited partners deserve. As I watched the Wellington family process their professional execution, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. This was vindication on a scale that transcended personal revenge. These people who had built their entire identity on inherited superiority were learning that merit, real merit, could emerge from anywhere and destroy anyone who underestimated it. The elevator ride down from TechFlow's executive floor was surreal. I could hear the muffled sounds of crisis management through office doors, urgent phone calls, hurried meetings, the controlled chaos of a company trying to survive the sudden departure of its entire leadership team. Employees watched me with curious eyes as I passed, probably wondering who this unremarkable woman was and why she had emerged from the boardroom while their executives remained behind to face their professional annihilation. Outside, the California sunshine felt different somehow, brighter, more warming, as if the weight of 8 years of careful deception had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I called Michelle from the parking lot, knowing she would be anxiously waiting for news about the confrontation. "It's done," I said simply when she answered. "Victoria's out, Miranda's finished, and the entire family is banned from the fund they built. James handled it perfectly." Michelle's response was a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine amazement. "April, the calls haven't stopped since news started leaking this morning. Every major VC firm in the Valley wants to pitch you on managing your portfolio. Goldman Sachs called twice. Even some sovereign wealth funds are reaching out through back channels." The irony was perfect. I had spent 8 years hiding my wealth to avoid exactly this kind of attention, only to have it forced into the open by people who couldn't recognize power when it was sitting across their dinner table. Now that the secret was out, Silicon Valley's entire ecosystem was reorganizing itself around the reality of my resources. But the most important conversation was still waiting for me at home. Benjamin had left work early after receiving what I assumed were increasingly frantic calls from his family members. I found him sitting on our couch, staring at his phone with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "They're saying you caused all of this," he said without looking up. "Miranda keeps calling, crying about how you destroyed their fund somehow. Victoria left a voicemail asking me to convince you to reverse whatever you did. I don't understand any of it." This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the conversation that would either strengthen our marriage or destroy it completely. Benjamin deserved the truth, all of it, regardless of the consequences. "Sit down," I said, settling beside him on the couch. "I need to tell you something that's going to change how you see everything." Over the next hour, I explained the entire scope of my hidden empire. The consulting business that served as cover for a $250 million investment portfolio. The international holdings that spanned 5 continents. The biotech ventures that were revolutionizing medicine while generating returns that exceeded most countries' GDP. The quiet accumulation of power that had taken 8 years to build and 5 days to weaponize against his family. Benjamin's reaction surprised me completely. Instead of anger about being deceived or shock about the scale of my wealth, his first words were an apology. "I'm so sorry they treated you like that," he said, pulling me into his arms with fierce protectiveness. "I knew they could be snobby, but I had no idea they were capable of such cruelty. You must have felt so humiliated sitting there listening to them dismiss everything you've accomplished." His understanding was instantaneous and complete. Benjamin grasped immediately that my revenge wasn't about money or power. It was about justice for systematic cruelty that went far beyond acceptable family tension. He saw the Wellington family's behavior for what it truly was, an unforgivable attack on the woman he loved, delivered with the kind of sophisticated brutality that could only come from people who had never faced real consequences for their actions. "Are you angry that I kept this from you?" I asked, needing to know if our foundation of honesty could survive such a massive secret. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I had revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same thoughtful consideration that had made me fall in love with him. "I understand why you did it," he said. "You wanted our relationship to be real, based on who we are rather than what you could provide. I can't be angry about that, even if it means my family just learned they've been living off money from someone they treated like garbage." The weeks that followed brought a cascade of consequences that rippled throughout Silicon Valley's interconnected ecosystem. Victoria's resignation made headlines in every major tech publication, with industry analysts speculating about the management failures that could lead to such a catastrophic investor withdrawal. The story became a cautionary tale that spread through boardrooms and networking events, a whispered warning about the dangers of judging people by superficial credentials. Miranda's career destruction was even more complete. Word spread quickly that she had been directly responsible for insulting the investor whose departure triggered TechFlow's collapse. Every major VC firm in the Valley quietly added her name to their internal blacklists, recognizing that someone who could cost a fund $250 million through sheer arrogance was too dangerous to employ regardless of her previous track record. Harrison's fall was perhaps the most poignant. His carefully cultivated network of social connections evaporated almost overnight as Silicon Valley's elite distanced themselves from the family that had committed such a spectacular failure in investor relations. Board positions were quietly rescinded, charity events found reasons to rescind invitations, and their Atherton mansion became a monument to fallen pride rather than continuing success. But the most meaningful change was happening in my own life. With my wealth no longer a secret, I began exploring ways to use my resources that went beyond personal financial growth. Michelle helped me establish Rodriguez Ventures, a fund specifically designed to support entrepreneurs from non-traditional backgrounds, state school graduates like myself, first-generation immigrants, and founders without family wealth or elite connections. The irony was exquisite. The very people the Wellington family had dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration became my primary investment focus. Within 6 months, we had backed 12 startups led by diverse founders who were solving real problems with innovative solutions that the traditional VC establishment had overlooked. Each successful investment felt like another victory against the narrow-minded elitism that had infected Silicon Valley for too long. When Maria Santos, a first-generation Mexican-American founder, successfully launched her medical device company using our seed funding, I thought about Victoria's dismissive comments about proper breeding. When David Chin, a community college graduate, built his logistics startup into a revenue-generating machine, I remembered Miranda's patronizing laughter about technical support. The Wellington family's story became a permanent part of Silicon Valley folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing inherited privilege with actual intelligence. Their downfall served as a reminder that in a world where merit ultimately mattered more than pedigree, underestimating someone based on their background could cost everything you had built. As I reflected on the entire experience months later, I realized that my revenge had accomplished something far more valuable than personal satisfaction. It had created a more inclusive, merit-based approach to investing that would outlast any individual act of retribution. The Wellington family's ashes had become fertile ground for something better. A venture capital ecosystem that recognized talent regardless of where it came from or how it chose to present itself. My victory was complete not just because I had destroyed those who tormented me, but because I had built something positive from their destruction that would continue growing long after their names were forgotten. My victory was complete not just because I had destroyed those who tormented me, but because I had built something positive from their destruction that would continue growing long after their names were forgotten. But as winter turned to spring and spring gave way to another Silicon Valley summer, I began to understand that the true measure of my revenge wouldn't be found in the immediate satisfaction of watching the Wellington family's empire crumble. It would be in the lasting changes that rippled outward from that moment of reckoning. 12 months after the TechFlow catastrophe, I found myself standing in the same Palo Alto restaurant where this entire story had begun, but everything had changed. Benjamin and I were celebrating the first anniversary of Rodriguez Ventures with Michelle and James, toasting a year that had exceeded every expectation I had dared to set. The irony of returning to Meridian wasn't lost on any of us. This temple of Silicon Valley excess had witnessed both my humiliation and indirectly my ultimate triumph. 27 portfolio companies, 12 showing strong revenue growth, 3 positioned for major exits. Michelle read from her tablet, her voice carrying the professional satisfaction of someone whose strategies had been vindicated spectacularly. The Rodriguez Ventures model is officially being studied by every major VC firm in the Valley. The fund's success wasn't just financial, it was philosophical proof that talent and innovation could emerge from anywhere when given proper support and resources. Maria Santos, the first-generation Mexican-American founder whose medical device company I had backed in those early months, had just received FDA approval and closed a $50 million Series B round. David Chin, the community college graduate who built logistics solutions, had sold his startup to Amazon for $200 million just last week. Each success story felt like another victory against the narrow-minded elitism that had infected Silicon Valley for too long. More importantly, these weren't isolated wins. They were part of a systematic demonstration that the venture capital world had been overlooking enormous pools of talent due to prejudices about educational pedigree and cultural background. James raised his glass with the kind of genuine smile that had made our business partnership so rewarding over the years. To April Rodriguez, who proved that the most dangerous person in any room might be the one everyone underestimates. But even as we celebrated, I found myself thinking about the Wellington family and wondering how their story had continued to unfold in the months since their spectacular downfall. The answer came in fragments, gathered through Silicon Valley's efficient gossip network and the occasional update from Benjamin's hesitant communications with his estranged relatives. Victoria's attempts to rebuild her career had been systematically thwarted by the Valley's long memory and interconnected network. Her consulting firm, launched with great fanfare 6 months after leaving TechFlow, had struggled to attract clients who remembered the $250 million disaster too clearly. Last I heard, she had relocated to Portland, working for a regional investment firm at a fraction of her former salary and influence. The woman who had once commanded respect in boardrooms across the Bay Area was now managing small-scale deals in a market that barely registered on Silicon Valley's radar. Miranda's career destruction had been even more complete. After being quietly blacklisted from every major VC firm in the Valley, she had eventually given up on venture capital entirely. Benjamin mentioned during one of our rare conversations about his family that she had taken a corporate development role at a struggling Austin startup, trading the power and prestige she had inherited for the anonymity of a market that didn't know her history. The golden daughter who had been groomed for Silicon Valley success was now just another mid-level executive trying to prove herself far from the ecosystem that had once been her birthright. Harrison's fall had been perhaps the most poignant to watch unfold. His carefully cultivated network of social connections had evaporated almost overnight, as Silicon Valley's elite distanced themselves from the family that had committed such a spectacular failure in investor relations. The Atherton mansion that had hosted legendary networking events was sold at a significant loss, the proceeds used to cover legal fees and outstanding obligations from TechFlow's messy liquidation. The master of social connectivity had discovered that relationships built on mutual advantage could disappear as quickly as they had formed. Benjamin's journey through his family's disgrace had been complex and painful, but ultimately strengthening for our marriage. Initially, there had been anger and blame directed at both of us, with family members convinced that I had deliberately infiltrated their circle to destroy them. Phone calls were bitter and accusatory, filled with demands that I somehow undo the financial consequences of their own behavior. But as months passed and the full scope of their treatment of me became undeniable, Benjamin began having increasingly difficult conversations with his relatives about accountability and consequences. He maintained contact with them, but established firm boundaries about how they could speak about his wife and our relationship. The Benjamin who had once been eager to integrate me into his family's world had evolved into someone who prioritized our partnership over their wounded pride. Victoria's formal apology letter arrived on a Tuesday morning 8 months after the crisis, delivered by certified mail with the kind of legal precision that suggested it had been reviewed by attorneys. The letter was stilted and defensive, carefully crafted to acknowledge wrongdoing without admitting liability, but it represented something I had never expected to receive: a grudging acknowledgement from the Wellington family that their treatment of me had been unacceptable. The apology wasn't genuine in any meaningful sense. Victoria's words read like a corporate press release, designed to check a box rather than convey authentic remorse. But Benjamin's insistence that his family provide some form of acknowledgement before he would consider rebuilding relationships with them demonstrated the strength of character that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. The TechFlow incident had become more than just a personal victory. It was a watershed moment that sparked broader conversations about bias and inclusion throughout Silicon Valley's venture capital ecosystem. Other firms began quietly examining their own investment patterns, asking uncomfortable questions about how many promising entrepreneurs they might have overlooked due to unconscious prejudices about educational background or cultural fit. Michelle had fielded dozens of calls from major VC firms wanting to understand the Rodriguez Ventures model, as if supporting diverse founders was some kind of revolutionary strategy rather than basic recognition of untapped talent. The requests for consulting and speaking engagements had grown so numerous that I had started declining most of them, preferring to let our portfolio company's success speak for itself. Tech publications were writing profiles about our unconventional investment approach, though I found it amusing that backing qualified founders from state schools was considered unconventional in an industry that prided itself on disrupting traditional thinking. The narrative was slowly shifting from surprise that diverse founders could succeed to embarrassment that it had taken so long for the industry to recognize obvious talent. Standing in that restaurant 12 months later, I realized that my revenge against the Wellington family had accomplished something far more significant than personal satisfaction. It had created a permanent change in how Silicon Valley thought about merit, talent, and the dangerous assumptions that came with inherited privilege. Their downfall had become a cautionary tale that would influence investment decisions for years to come. The woman who had once hidden her wealth to avoid uncomfortable attention was now using that same wealth to systematically dismantle the barriers that had made such hiding necessary in the first place. Every successful investment in a founder from a non-traditional background was another crack in the wall of elitism that had dominated venture capital for too long. As we left Meridian that evening, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the restaurant's polished glass doors. The same woman who had endured systematic humiliation at this very location just 1 year earlier. But everything else had changed. The scared, hidden investor had become a public force for change. The woman who had absorbed condescension and silence had found her voice and used it to reshape an entire industry's approach to recognizing talent. The Wellington family's certainty about their ability to assess worth based on superficial credentials had cost them everything they had built over a century. My quiet accumulation of real power had not only survived their attack but had emerged stronger, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone else who might mistake humility for weakness. Sometimes justice comes with compound interest, and sometimes the most lasting revenge is simply proving that the people who dismissed you were catastrophically wrong about everything that actually matters. This story proves that respect isn't determined by your diploma, but by your character. What was your favorite moment of April's incredible journey? Did the Wellington family get what they deserved? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more tales of justice and triumph.